one of the first problems is that those who don't have sensory sensitivity have great difficulty conceptualizing how painful it is. It's not uncomfortable, it's pain. As someone I was talking to recently, an adult who was able to say, when that sensory experience occurs, it's like poking your finger into a 240 volt electric socket. It really does hurt. Now this is going to affect behavior, it's going to increase anxiety, because when these experiences are going to occur, and you create a lifestyle to avoid pain. So that one of the first things for people to recognize is that in fact it's incredibly painful. The second is it can be for a whole range of sensory experiences. Obviously auditory can be picked up because the child goes and becomes very upset by that sound, and you can link the facial expression to the sound that's occurring. But it can also be visual intensity for fluorescent lights, etc. It can be aroma of not liking someone because they smell of coffee. It can be all the sensory systems, and including aspects of where you are in space and movement and a whole range of things. Like some will absolutely enjoy being on a swing, others absolutely hate it. So the variation in sensory sensitivity is as variable as each child. There is a psychological link between sensory sensitivity and anxiety. I think that the sensory sensitivity occurs first, and then the person is anxious about when these experiences are going to occur. Sometimes the child knows that that's going to happen, but other times they don't, and it comes as a complete surprise to them, and that leads to a, should we say, a hypervigilance and anxiety. But what we also know is that anxiety amplifies the actual sensory sensitivity, so the two go together. And so it's very important, if you're dealing with sensory sensitivity, not only to focus on the sensory experience, but also to manage the anxiety. In autism, one thing that the kids are really good at is worrying. For neurological reasons, they are nature's worriers. And there are many things to worry about. Sensory experience, making a mistake, social engagement, conversation not being understood, a whole range of things is going to make that person anxious. They have great difficulty understanding the pattern, coherence and social aspects, as well as sensory aspects of life. And that leads to a great degree of anxiety, which is exhausting for that individual. What they'll do is develop a range of strategies to cope with their anxiety that includes special interest as a thought blocker, because when you're playing Minecraft, no anxious thought intrudes on the fixation. Another one is to become very controlling and very defiant and refusing to do requests, because it could be associated with anxiety. So they become a control freak, and if you surrender to that, then you've got a domestic terrorist who controls the whole family. Another way of coping with anxiety is to have routines and rituals that must be completed. So before you go to school, you've got to bounce on the trampoline, you've got to run there, you've got to do that, and you have to do it to alleviate your anxiety. Or to fall asleep, you have your ritual. But there's another way, and that is to have a meltdown. And sometimes the meltdown erases the buildup of tension over time. It's like a balloon that's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and you have to have an explosion. Oh, I feel better now. It's what psychologists call negative reinforcement. It's Panadol. So if you have a buildup of stress and anxiety, you have an explosion, now you're okay, nobody else is okay. One of the characteristics of autism is a fear of making a mistake, but also of being judged. And not being up to the standard required. What we find, interestingly, this is usually imposed by the child, not the parents or the teacher. They often fear making a mistake. But it also means that sometimes other children recognize this sensitivity, and the predators will focus on, ooh, you're stupid, you are weird, you hear things nobody else can hear. There'll be a negative reaction to that. And this will affect self-esteem and also a sense of identity. It's an interesting topic that when I ask adults with ASD, who are you? They usually define the self by what they do and what they know, rather than their social network and descriptions of personality. And so the sense of self is also determined, especially in adolescence, by the reaction of the peer group. Parents are past their use by date. It's what the peer group think of you. And my concern is not autism, it's the peer group and how they can destroy self-esteem for a moment's enjoyment, which then becomes a sense of belief. I am stupid, I will never get a friend, and so on. And then it becomes a filter system that they will only allow through that which confirms their negative self-esteem and self-belief. And anything that anyone else, a parent or teacher, says is heresy to their belief. So what is very important is positive feedback, not just from parents or teachers, but I think more importantly, from their peers. I think resilience is going to be important for an inner strength, both for the social challenges and the sensory sensitivity. So resilience is going to be very important. One of the difficulties that there may be a lack of success socially and academically. But one of the things to focus on is personality, who you are, that you're incredibly brave to actually go to school. You have a wicked sense of humour. You are a person who's very loyal. You are a person who, in many ways, speaks your mind openly. So we focus on who you are, and that's sometimes forgotten in the whole process. It's the personality. You see disability, you see defect, but you've also got to look at a hero. You've got to look at someone there, but for the grace of God, go I. How would I cope with all those challenges? So really saying, we are amazed at your resilience and how you're coping. Keep going. As a clinician, when I meet someone with ASD for the first time, yes, I'm analysing the social, the cognitive, linguistic and the sensory and so on. But I've also got to assess who. Some people rage against the ASD. Good. I'm glad that they do, because then they've got energy to fight it and to, in many ways, overcome it. My concern is those who surrender to it, and you see the lights go out and I think, oh dear, you will probably stay like that. So I actually welcome people with challenging behaviour, because then there's a mismatch between ability and performance. And if you've got someone who's got character, who's got that strength to them, yes, I'd rather have that than someone who's wishy-washy and surrender. I think we need to talk to the adults to find out what affects their daily life, so that education and therapy prepares that person for adult life. And when I ask the adults, what are your greatest challenges? It's anxiety and sensory, not necessarily the social, because they say, I've created a social network, which is enough for me. And I have a lifestyle that meets my intellect and abilities, etc. But my anxiety is something that really challenges me every day. But also sensory sensitivity, because we do find in the long term that the sensory sensitivity can not only affect the person's quality of life, it restricts their quality of life. that they won't do things because of the possibility of sensory experiences. They won't go to the supermarket because of all the bright lights and the colours, etc. So sometimes the social withdrawal is actually because of sensory sensitivity. So we do need to focus on that. And many adults will say, what's happened is I've learnt to endure it, to cope with it, to try and accommodate the characteristics. But they were a generation that never had access to the therapies we have today. It's a myth that the label is going to be cumbersome and restrict that child's development and abilities. That tells me about neurotypicals, not those with ASD, because they're scared that it's going to affect attitude. I would see it as a positive change in attitude. However, when I talk to adults diagnosed for the first time, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s sometimes, and I say, when would you have liked to have known of your diagnosis? They nearly always say, as soon as possible. Because there are compensatory mechanisms of depression. I'm stupid, I'm defective, I will never have anything. There is also escaping into imagination and confusion with schizophrenia because he's in a world of his own. There can be an arrogance and omnipotence which makes people shun that person because they're trying to build up their own self-esteem as a compensation. Or they'll imitate and act but not get the services that they need. So once the diagnosis is made, there can be a closure of why you're different. And the kid themselves will know they are different. But it's also the question of the other kids. Other children are natural child psychologists. They have a schema of what this kid should be like. And if it is a negative appreciation, then they will bully and tease. What we want is compassion, support and understanding, not rejection, and seeing this person as another species. So we are absolved in guilt should we be cruel and tease this person. So the diagnosis can change attitude. And that is going to be important not only for teachers who are going to go, whoa, I need to think ASD here and change my approach, but also for other kids to come to that person's rescue and support, but also for that person to have a realistic sense of self rather than an expectation, I've got to be like everybody else. And if I'm not, I'm a failure. When actually they're a hero, they're a great success. It's how far they've travelled to achieve it is far greater than any other kid. And that needs to be applauded. Be true to who you are, be a first-rate ASPE, not a second-rate neurotypical. I've worked in this area, enjoyed, had a passion in this area for over 40 years, officially. And one of the amazing things that keeps me going is the variability in the personalities and abilities of those with ASD and the outcomes. Some of the kids that I've seen who are 2, 3, 4 years old have been the most profoundly autistic, socially withdrawn, no communication, have ended up professors of astronomy. And that's one of the reasons I like this area, because I cannot use the level of autism at 2, 3, 4 years old to tell you what it's going to be like later on. There can be quite significant changes. And there is a phrase that I didn't coin, but it's important. When you meet someone with autism, you've met one person with autism, and the variation in expression and over time is phenomenal. So I'm still discovering new aspects. And one of the areas, of course, is sensory. We're only just starting to come to terms and recognizing it, because neurotypicals have been arrogant in saying, well, just ignore it. The kids can't ignore it. It's painful. It's only when you recognize the experience of it that you realize this person needs understanding. Autism is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. The brain is wired differently, and there are particular areas of the brain that we look for: the frontal lobe and the temporal lobes, especially left temporal, which is associated with language and emotion management, the frontal lobes with social reasoning, what we call the orbitofrontal cortex, the area behind the left orbit. So we know there are areas of the brain associated with autism spectrum disorder, and sometimes that neurological dysfunction can be sufficient to create epilepsy. Now, there can be the classic tonic-clonic seizures. You fall to the floor and you shake, and that's very conspicuous. Terrifying for parents when it's happening. But you can also get subclinical seizures and what used to be called temporal lobe or complex partial seizures that are an odd expression of behavior. And so there's a child I saw recently, and he was notorious for quite disturbed and destructive behavior. And in analysing and seeing videos of what's going on, I thought, no, he's not doing that for any purpose. It's not a reaction to a particular situation. He's completely lost it. And there's a certain pattern that we look for neurologically that this could be a particular form of epilepsy. And it was confirmed, and I was delighted. An anticonvulsant medication has significantly improved his behaviour, far greater than anything a clinical psychologist can create in a program. It was an epileptic seizure. Yes. Now, the greater the degree of autism and intellectual impairment, the greater the likelihood of epilepsy. Right. There are two, how should we say, sensitive times in development when seizures can occur. First 2 years of life and the onset of puberty. So sometimes the first seizures are at 12, 13, 14 years old. So parents need to know about that. And so that's why it's important to have contact with your paediatrician and maybe a referral to a paediatric neurologist just to see if certain behaviours or characteristics could be seizure related or genuine epilepsy. We have some amazing medications now to help on that, but there is an association, and in those with autism and intellectual disability, 1 in 3 will develop seizures by the late teens. One of the things we look for is that this behaviour is out of character. Yes. There wasn't a gradual build-up of naughtiness and so on. It just happened out the blue. Yes. It was incredibly intense and very destructive. And one of the things that we notice is that quite often the child afterwards is exhausted, but may have no memory of what occurred. And so there is a certain behavioural pattern, and this is where it's so important for parents to film this, because the neurologist or clinical psychologist can look at the behaviour and go, wow, this isn't a conscious mind manipulating the situation for what I can get. It's not a tantrum. It's not a sensory meltdown because of overload. Yes. There's a qualitative difference that suggests this is a seizure. So yes, it's a tantrum. Perhaps, yes, it could be a meltdown. But yes, it could also be epilepsy.